In this video, I want to talk about why I still shoot on Super 35 and why I personally find it to be a competitive advantage, especially in the cinematography space. It seems like since the 5D Mark II, every camera company has been trying to create a full frame or bigger than full frame camera sensor to compete. I think everyone was racing to make full frame video cameras that can do stills and video and hybrid beasts and all these different cameras when we failed to specialize in one certain look. Now, a good example of this would be like a Canon R5 or like a Sony a7 IV, a camera that is phenomenal with stills and the video lacks significantly because they compromise both the stills and the video. Now, in instances where I do still photography, I personally think that full frame is excellent. One of the reasons why I like full frame is because you have a deeper shallow depth of field, so for portraits it looks better. There's a wider field of view too, so you can use wider lenses and get that distinct look. And then in a video point of view, it's easier to do anamorphic lenses because you have a bigger image circle. Those little instances are the exception rather than the things I use on the regular. So why do I like Super 35? I honestly think Super 35 is a dying art. When we go back and look at older movies, and I think about Ben-Hur, and I think about these older movies shot on 35mm film, Super 35 has been the standard for the most of cinema's existence. And I think big sensors, whether it's 65mm film or it's the Arri Alexa Mini LF or all these different cameras, have their place. But when we make the full frame sensor the new normal, it makes it not as interesting to shoot that. I personally love Super 35 for a few reasons. One of them being, I think Super 35 is a unique look in this day and age. It's unique to have tighter shots. I think wide angle shots are overdone. I'm tired of seeing Sony FX3 footage everywhere, quite frankly, because I think it all looks the same. And the full frame blurry depth of field is starting to look cheap. And what I mean by this is when you look at things shot on the volume or things shot with a digital background screen, the key to selling the effect is to blur out the background. And so now all of our work is just blurry background to the point that you don't see anything. And I personally am of the nature of maybe you shoot at an f5.6 or even sometimes an f8 where you still do have some of that depth of field, but you have more detail to experience the set design, the art direction, and yada, yada, yada. One of the other advantages that people don't talk about Super 35 enough is when you use a lens with a small f-stop, you get more light, but you don't have to deal with the more shallow depth of field. So you can shoot wider open on a Super 35 camera and have more in focus than if you were on a full frame camera. This is really important to understand because in my personal work, I can shoot at an f2, get the light I need, but not necessarily as blurry of a background as someone on full frame. Now, when blurry backgrounds were the new rave, and I'm thinking about like 2013, 2015 cinematography, it was so cool to have that blurry background because that meant you were professional. Now, I think we're kind of in this pivotal moment where everyone is so used to full frame, unless you're shooting on like an iPhone, that it's unique to actually flip it on its head and go back to Super 35. If we're talking professional cameras, I'm talking about high-end cinema cameras like the Arri Alexa 35 or I'm talking about like a Sony Venice. All these different cameras, most of the lenses for these higher-end cameras are actually Super 35 because it's a smaller image circle. So when you do start renting this nicer end equipment, you realize a lot of times people end up shooting on Super 35 lenses. This does not mean we should scrap full frame altogether or even not shoot on full frame. What I'm saying is we need to be more intentional about how we choose our sensor sizes. And personally, I've found shooting on Super 35 when all of my colleagues are shooting in full frame has been a way that I've been able to distinguish my creative style, my taste, and shoot tighter because I personally prefer shooting tighter than wider. Another thing to note is I like that a lot of cameras now have the option to shoot windowed or not. So one good example of this was last summer I shot on the Canon R5C, and it actually has a nice mode where you can crop in from a full frame sensor to a Super 35 mode. So the full sensor is 8K resolution, but because I'm only shooting in 4K, I could take my full frame lenses and then punch into Super 35 and get the Super 35 look on a full frame camera. You should always try to shoot on what the preferred maximum quality resolution is on your sensor, because when you shoot on these windowed Super 35 modes, it's not as sharp and there's much more grain and noise. I'm also calling on camera companies to create more Super 35 cameras. I understand that's a super rare take, especially these days, but I do think we should not forget the art of Super 35. And Super 35 is where cinema lives. Super 35, just to me, is easier to frame because it's tighter, it feels more intimate, and it feels more close. Whereas full frame is like blurry background, super wide, super far away, which is definitely also a style that is super popular. And I'm not here to hate on any side of the aisle. I just personally wanted to express my opinions on why I think Super 35 is honestly super underrated and people don't really talk about it enough. And it took a lot of courage for me to buy a Blackmagic 6K Pro over the 6K full frame. Strictly, one of the reasons was Super 35. But at the end of the day, I'm here to make the stuff that I want to see, and my cinematography style is uniquely my own. And so I think we need to embrace different codecs, different cameras, different sensor sizes, different things in order to make our work stand out from the craft. So if you were interested in this little video, stay tuned for more. I'm planning on doing one video a week, and I thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next week. Peace.